This is our presentation on the 1830s and 1900s. While the 1900s foreign policy was centered around the motives of expanding our sphere of influence economically through the political agenda of realpolitik, the 1830s motives were essentially centered upon a change in settlement patterns and a growth in slavery practices, both of which were due to new technologies. Now, the 1830s were primarily focused around two major aspects, and those would be regionalism and manifest destiny, both of which gaining ground up as a side effect of the Louisiana Purchase. Regionalism really got started in the South among the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. By that time, the North and South had become opposites, whereas the South was run by agriculture and the North was run by industry. As mentioned before, one of the major driving forces behind westward expansion was manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was the movement out west that the Americans thought was justified by God. The reason why manifest destiny took off in the 1830s was because of the new technological boom that created railroads and steam-powered boats. Another premise of what it meant to be a U.S. citizen was the right to vote. And back then, in order to do so, you needed to have land. Through the Louisiana Purchase, Southern farmers tried to fix this dilemma by moving into different territories. They tried to move production to Mexico, Cuba, and California, but all attempts failed to various degrees. However, as mentioned earlier, this didn't stop them from trying to make as many of the new, smaller states as pro-slavery as possible, as doing so would, as mentioned before, help them gain control of the Senate. In doing this, however, the South was constantly eating up its own land, as wealthy landowners bought out massive plots of land for the growth of cash crops such as cotton, forcing smaller farmers to migrate west in hopes of getting land, and subsequently representation. This is important because the Founding Fathers' definition of a U.S. citizen from the very beginning was someone who had land. As these small farmers moved out westward and began developing land, slavery became an increasingly prevalent issue. By having more slave states than free states, slave states would have more leverage within the Senate and keep slavery upheld. Even in light of the 36-30 Compromise, new territories and states annexed by the United States, such as California, would still be frequent topics of debate. Now, let's move on to the 1900s. The 1900s was similar to the 1830s in that it was marked by large westward expansion, but differed in due part to the Industrial Revolution. Why the Industrial Revolution was so important is that it effectively industrialized the entire United States, the South included. Utilization of the scientific method fostered an emphasis on empirical evidence in order to back up claims. However, uses of such critical thinking really gave way to an argument of genetic superiority, social Darwinism, that justified the implementation of prejudiced practices, such as sharecropping and segregation. The 1900s also gave rise to a new form of governance called realpolitik. Under Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy was famous for saying, "Speak softly and carry a large stick." What this quote means is that the U.S. should be more involved in global affairs, while secretly posing a threat to our military might. Teddy Roosevelt got involved in many important events for the sake of the American interest. Such examples include the Panama Canal, where he brought in our Navy to assist rebels, the Russo-Japanese War, in which he acted as a mediator between the two feuding nations, and the stopping of Japanese immigration to San Francisco. Now, perhaps the most important thing to come out of the 1900s was this concept called imperialism. At its core, imperialism is all about having as much of the world following the United States policies as possible. And if we had to conquer our enemies to spread our freedom, then so be it. This imperialist movement was one of the driving forces behind the Spanish-American War, and succeeded in bringing territories such as Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico under American authority. It's important to note the difference between manifest destiny and imperialism here. whereas manifest destiny is based off of God-given rights. Imperialism is a byproduct of social Darwinism and beliefs in cultural superiority based upon empirical evidence. Another primary example of how imperialism was used to capitalize U.S. profits was with China and Japan. China was seen as a solution to the overproduction caused by the Industrial Revolution, and the United States basically did everything within our power to get to China's open markets, even by going through Japan to get there. One of the primary advocates for this immersion in the Chinese economy was President William McKinley, a huge believer in free markets and capitalist superiority. However, imperialism's spread also sparked an anti-imperialist movement, in which intellectuals such as Mark Twain and Albert Bervierge argued that such thinking was an affront to our very beliefs as Americans. Which begs the question, is democracy compatible with imperialism? The ideas in the early 1900s of expanding our political sphere of influence in American foreign policy relate to the time of the Cold War, when President Truman implemented the strategy of containment to stop the Soviet Union from influencing other countries in its area. Truman decided to use the realpolitik concept when converting the countries around the Soviet Union into democratic countries. Although the foreign policy of containment was used as a wartime method, the similarities between expansion and the sphere of influence in the 1900s is abundantly clear. Thank you.